Hi, hello, I'm Sam Harrison. I read, review and discuss fantasy and science fiction books. Today I've got a discussion for you on my fantasy starter pack. What's a starter pack, you ask? So I'm looking at the starter pack as a selection of 4 books that give you an example of the genres that will be something that people who don't currently read fantasy and sci-fi, this is kind of a way to kind of get them in and give them a taster. So all of these books are very accessible. Most of them are easy to find online, secondhand, or are on Kindle Unlimited. So the plan is to make this kind of easy for people who aren't into fantasy to start reading, and also to kind of give them that kind of nice little view and window into the genre. So I've been reading fantasy books ever since I was a teenager. I took a really long break, basically when the smartphone released, and I could start browsing the internet instead of reading books while I was on the bus. And then after the pandemic in 2021, I got really back into reading in a big way and have since started this channel. I've read like over 100 books in the last 2 years, and I'm reading more and more, and I'm loving, absolutely love fantasy. It's one of my favorite genres, and I feel like I've read enough now to give everybody a really good 4 books to start their fantasy journey with. So I'm going to start with some categories. So my first category is classic fantasy. So when I'm talking about classic fantasy, I'm not talking about things like Beowulf, although many people will say you should read Beowulf. What I want to do is to give new readers an idea of what the genre looked like when I was younger in the 90s. Well, I was very young when this book came out, but you know, I want to give people a view of what this genre was back in the 90s, with a book that is still very, very readable and accessible and enjoyable. So I have picked for the classic slot in my starter pack, Magician by Raymond D. Feist. In the US, I believe this is sold as 2 volumes, Magician Apprentice and Magician Master. Consider this a recommendation for both as a whole, as 1 volume as Magician. That's how I read it. I can see where you could make a break in the middle of that novel, but for me personally, it's kind of like one big story. Magician is the story of a young boy called Pug. Pug is trying to get picked as an apprentice in a castle at the kind of the edges of the kingdom, and nobody is kind of interested in him. And then one day he is picked by the castle's magician, and he is trained to be a wizard and to use magic to protect the family that live in the castle. And then just as he's kind of getting started on his journey, his country is thrown into war with a mysterious invader, and he's kind of put right at the center of it because of a kind of unique way that he casts his magic. So I absolutely love this story. I read it when I was a teenager, but absolutely I've been thinking about reading it again because I loved it so much. This was actually probably my first big chunky fantasy novel. Most of the books on this list actually also are shorter, are not big and chunky. So this is a really good one for you to get that view, if you haven't read fantasy before, of what reading these massive books is like. This one is like 500-600 pages. It's incredibly enjoyable all the way through. I think that all the characters are fantastic. The world building is excellent. And like all of the books on this list, if you really enjoy it, there are sequels. Though the one thing I'll say about Magician is that it is also quite standalone. So there's plot threads that are left that can be picked up in future books, but you could read Magician completely by itself, because that's what I did. I read Magician by itself and I didn't pick up the sequel for years after. I have since read got like 10 books in this series, and they're all very good. But Raymond E. Feist is very good in kind of splitting his books into series within series. So you can just read the first book, you can just read the first 3. It all works really well for you. Okay, so we have just finished talking about classic fantasy. Let's now talk about modern fantasy. And I want to talk to you guys about the person who's kind of thought of as like the master of modern fantasy, which is Brandon Sanderson. So Brandon Sanderson is arguably the most popular fantasy author in the world. Is he the best fantasy author in the world? No, I don't think so. But his books are very approachable and accessible. They have very easy to read prose. Sanderson's very accessible. He's very easy to get into. And his book, The Final Empire, was actually my gateway back into reading fantasy back in 2021. So that's the one that I'm going to recommend. So this book is called The Final Empire. That's what it was released as, although it's mostly referred to as Mistborn. It is the first in the Mistborn book. There are eventually 2 more sequels to this book, and there's actually a sequel series. And Mistborn, the kind of overarching series, is also a part of Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere work of books. The Cosmere is like 20 odd books now, but you can absolutely read this first book and put the series down and never read anymore. I think this book works really well standalone. It is a heist story set in a world with a really cool magic system which revolves around metals and magnetism, where basically the people of this world are kind of sensitive to certain kinds of metals, and when they ingest them, they're able to use those metals as fuel for different magics. So, for example, one of the characters is able to ingest bronze, and then when he has bronze, he can kind of play with other people's emotions. So he can like subtly stroke different emotions, which I think is a really, really cool way of using that magic. Sorry, my cat wanted to join the video, so he was scratching at the office door here. So, Mistborn is this like heist story set in a fantasy world where the kind of evil big dark lord villain character has won and taken over the world, and he has subjugated this race of people called the Scar, and the Scar are some of them have sensitivity to these metals and can use these magics, and the main characters are basically a heist crew, all of which have different magical specialisms that all work together to enable them to enact kind of like this really cool heist plot. It's a lot of fun. It's kind of like a mix of like Ocean's 11, Magnificent 7, like, you know, these sorts of like gathering the crew, doing an elaborate thing sort of stories. And I think that almost anyone would really, really enjoy it. The main character, Vin, is a teenage girl. However, it is not YA at all. It is marketed as YA in some countries, but I would say this is definitely an adult fantasy, just happens to star a young female character. I'd really recommend it. I think it's one of Sanderson's best works, and it's also a great entry point into his work if you would like to read more of it. Up next, my third category is urban fantasy. So for urban fantasy, you might be expecting me to pick Dresden Files, which is one of my favourite series of all time, which is an urban fantasy. However, I think the first book of the Dresden Files is not as good as the first book in another urban fantasy series. Now, urban fantasy is essentially fantasy set in a more modern city setting. Often this is our world, but in this case, I have picked Jade City by Fonda Lee. Jade City is set in an island nation called Kikon, I think, yeah. I was about to say Kowloon, but that's an actual place. Set in Kikon. Kikon is the only source in the world of a magical mineral called jade. And certain jade-sensitive people who are only ever born in Kikon can use jade to make themselves stronger, faster, more deadly, to heal wounds, to fire energy blasts. Jade is very, very versatile, and Jade warriors are incredibly powerful and strong. There's basically, the country of Kikon is run by a government, but also two mafia-esque gangs. They aren't criminal gangs, but they do everything that criminal gangs would do. But they're kind of accepted into the culture as running the country. It's an incredibly interesting setup. We follow one of these two gangs. So we follow the No Peak clan, which is led by the Cool family of Lan, Hilo, and Shay. And Lan has fairly recently become the pillar, the leader of this clan, and his brother and sister are the clan's kind of two leading, next in line sort of, leading. They're part of the clan leadership, essentially. Shay's been away for 5 years in another country. Hilo is leader of the army of the gang. It's an incredibly interesting story. I think the family dynamic is fantastic in this book. I think that the world building that Fonda Lee does is fantastic. She manages to make Kikon, even though it is a fantastical world, feel like it is basically a country in our world. She's done such a great job with it. I think the series is fantastic overall, but again, Jade City can be read completely standalone. Next up, we have my final category, which is something that I thought over quite a lot. And this category is self-published. So I think that fantasy in particular has had a real self-published renaissance, where in many cases publishers are not looking to publish stories that are like the ones that people love, like Wheel of Time, or they might not be looking for more books in those genres, although the fantasy publishers don't have the money to put behind as many authors as there are incredible authors in the space. And I've been reading lots of self-published fantasy, and I don't know, I feel like the self-published side of fantasy is really important at the moment, and I think that it's a huge part of the genre. For my self-published fantasy, I have chosen The Way of Anan by Philip Chase. So, The Way of Anan is, I think, a really fantastic example of self-published fantasy, because it's not really like anything that I'm seeing on the shelves. It is this blend of the more modern style of fantasy that you'll read in Brandon Sanderson's work, and also the classic style of fantasy that you'd see from someone like J.R.R. Tolkien in The Lord of the Rings. It gives you this modern storytelling sensibility and style, but also this flavour of this traditional work. It stars a character called Dayraven, who, after an encounter with an elf, realises that he has incredible magical power, and he's basically kind of an unwilling, unwitting chosen one to save the world from domination by an evil church that worships a god called Anan. So essentially, The Way of Anan, hence the name of the book. So Dayraven and his best friend Imhar travel across the country to try and learn to control Dayraven's incredible powers and abilities. You might hear some purring from the cat because he's really trying to lick this microphone now. Dayraven and Imhar have this really interesting adventure with lots of twists and turns. This one is a little more difficult to recommend as a standalone. I think you could read and enjoy this book, and I went months without reading the sequel. But I do think, come on buddy, you're going to ruin the video. I do think that the sequel book is also excellent. You could kind of stop at that sequel because there is a really strong ending to that second book. I haven't read the third book yet, so I cannot tell you from personal experience whether I think that the whole trilogy is very good, but I will say that the third book gets basically rave reviews from everyone and is apparently quite experimental and interesting. So I think that the Anan trilogy is probably a great place to start your self-published fantasy journey. So, have you read any of my fantasy starter pack? Are there any books that you think that I should have put in instead of the ones that I've talked about here? I chose specifically to talk about books that had very, very strong first books in series, which is why you'll see Jade City over Dresden Files, which is why you'll see Mistborn over other series that might have kind of weaker first entries. Also, Mistborn is probably the number one access point for people. I think basically everyone who reads fantasy is like, oh yeah, and I got back into it reading Mistborn. And also, that's why, even though I have not finished the series of The Way of Anan, the Anan trilogy, and I am up to date on Ryan Carhill's Bound and the Broken, which is my favourite fantasy series and also happens to be self-published, I do think The Way of Anan is better than the first book in The Bound and the Broken of Blood and Fire. So that's why I've picked those books. But if you've got some recommendations to fill these slots, then please do let me know. You may wonder why I didn't include Lord of the Rings in the classic fantasy section. It's because I don't like it and I don't think it's very accessible. I am going to try and reread Lord of the Rings someday, but that time has not come yet because there's still too much good modern fantasy that I know I will enjoy more. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please give it a like and drop a comment down below, like I said, to tell me how dumb I am for not liking Lord of the Rings. And please subscribe to the channel so you can see more videos where I may or may not dunk on Lord of the Rings. Thanks so much for watching. I'll speak to you tomorrow.